The day everything fell apart, I still remembered the day her email arrived in my inbox. The subject line was just one word: shattered. When I opened it, I felt like I was reading the confessions of a woman whose life had cracked in a single moment. She had been engaged to her college sweetheart for almost 5 years. They'd planned everything: the house, the wedding, the children, and then, 2 weeks before the vows, he left. No warning, no explanation, just a text message that said, "I can't do this." She said she felt her body go cold, like her heart had stopped beating and refused to start again. Everyone in their small town knew about their engagement, about the white dress waiting in her closet. She couldn't bring herself to tell her mother right away. She just lay in bed for 3 days, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment they'd shared, wondering if it had all been a lie, if she had been blind, if there was something broken inside her that made men leave. On the 4th morning, she finally showered and went downstairs. Her mother was in the kitchen, pretending not to notice how swollen her eyes were. She tried to pour herself coffee, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. That was when the grief started to change shape. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was humiliation. Everyone would pity her. They'd whisper behind her back that she must have done something wrong. She said the worst part wasn't the heartbreak, it was the shame, the quiet dread of being seen as the woman who wasn't good enough to keep a man. Every friend who called tried to say comforting things, but she could hear the relief in their voices, the way people feel safer when someone else's life falls apart instead of theirs. She swore she'd never be that vulnerable again. She promised herself she'd take control, no matter what it cost. That's when the idea started to flicker. Just a tiny spark in the back of her mind. If he could walk away so easily, maybe she could show him she didn't need him to be happy. Maybe she could show the whole town she was still worth something, even if it meant doing something reckless, something that would change her life forever. She didn't want to feel small anymore. She wanted to feel powerful. And in that raw, desperate place, she made a decision she never could have imagined. A year earlier, she would marry someone else. Not for love, not even for companionship. She would marry to prove a point, to rewrite the ending he'd tried to force on her. She didn't care if it sounded crazy. In her heart, she was already halfway committed to the plan. When she finally pressed send on that email to me, she ended it with a single line that chilled me. Sometimes you have to burn your own life down just to see who you are without it. And as I sat there reading her story, I realized I was about to tell you something no one else has heard before. The proposal she never expected. The next part of her email felt almost surreal to me. She wrote that 2 days after her fiancé left, she walked into the small insurance office where she worked. Her boss, Mr. Langford, was waiting at her desk. He was older, maybe late 40s, with a kind face that had watched her grow up in that company. She thought he was going to offer condolences. Instead, he sat down across from her, folded his hands, and said something she never expected. He told her he'd heard what happened, that he knew how cruel people could be in their little town. He looked into her eyes and said, "I don't want you to feel like you have no choices." She felt her breath catch in her throat as he hesitated. Then, in the quietest voice, he told her he'd been alone a long time, that he respected her more than any woman he'd ever met, and that if she wanted, he would marry her. She said her mind couldn't process the words. They sat in the air like smoke she couldn't wave away. Marry him? She barely knew anything about his private life, but in that instant, something dangerous and liberating bloomed in her chest. He wasn't asking because he loved her, not in the way she had once dreamed. He was offering her a kind of shelter, a way to reclaim her dignity, a way to silence the pity. She went home that evening with her heart thudding like it was going to explode. She poured a glass of wine and stood in front of the mirror, studying her own face. She asked herself over and over, is this insane? Maybe, but what did she have left to lose? Her reputation was already in tatters. Her dreams were ashes. Maybe a clean break from everything she'd thought she wanted was the only path forward. That night, she didn't sleep. She imagined what her life could look like if she said yes. Not a fairy tale, but stability, respect, a life that belonged to her, on her terms. She thought about the faces of everyone who'd whispered about her broken engagement. The same people who'd tutted and gossiped. She pictured them realizing she hadn't just survived, she had risen. That thought felt like oxygen in her lungs. By morning, she had made her decision. She would not be a victim of her ex-fiancé's cowardice. She would not let the town define her as the jilted bride. She would become something else entirely. Someone who didn't wait for permission to start over. Someone who rewrote her own ending, no matter how unconventional it looked from the outside. And with her hands trembling, she picked up the phone. She dialed Mr. Langford's number and waited, listening to the slow, measured rings. When he answered, she took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. "I think I'd like to talk about your offer." The marriage contract she described sitting across from Mr. Langford at a little cafe on Main Street, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. As she stirred her coffee, she realized people were already watching them through the windows. For the first time in weeks, she didn't care. She felt like she was in the eye of a storm, strangely calm as everything else spun around her. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. A simple agreement, he called it. Not a love letter, more like a business proposal. He wanted her to be clear. This wouldn't be a romance. He respected her too much to pretend. But he would give her a home, security, and a place in his life. In return, he asked only for honesty, for loyalty, and for her to consider giving him a family someday. Her hands trembled as she read the words. The pragmatism of it both shocked and comforted her. She looked up at him and saw no hidden agenda, no desperation. Just a man who had grown tired of loneliness. A man who believed two people could build something steady together. Even if it wasn't the storybook ending she'd once imagined. And in that moment, she felt a strange peace settle over her heart. Maybe this was the closest she'd ever come to true freedom, choosing without illusions. They signed the agreement the next morning. No flowers, no celebration. Just two signatures, side by side, on a piece of paper that felt heavier than any vow she'd ever dreamed of. As she slid the pen across the table, she thought of her ex-fiance's face, and she felt nothing. No grief, no longing, only relief. Later that day, she packed the last of her things from her old apartment. She left behind the wedding dress she'd once chosen with such hope. She didn't need it anymore. She was stepping into a different life, one that didn't require lace and tulle to feel real. She felt raw and new, like she was finally shedding someone else's expectations. That night, she moved into Mr. Langford's house. It was a quiet place with sturdy walls and a view of the hills. She unpacked her books, her photographs, and a single framed picture of herself as a little girl. She set it on the dresser as a reminder. She was still that girl in some ways, but she had survived more than she ever thought she could. And as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, she whispered to herself that this wasn't settling. It was claiming. It was deciding that her story wouldn't end with betrayal. It would begin again, in the most unexpected way. The marriage contract, the first months together. She wrote about those first months in Mr. Langford's house with a mixture of disbelief and quiet gratitude. Every morning, she woke before dawn to watch the fog roll across the hills behind the kitchen window. It was the only time she allowed herself to wonder what her life would have been like if she'd never said yes. But as soon as the sun rose, she let the questions go. He was kind in all the ways she hadn't expected. He never asked about her past unless she chose to share it. He never pried into old wounds or tried to pretend they didn't exist. He treated her like an equal, not a rescued damsel. And in that gentle distance, she found room to breathe again. At night, they ate dinner side by side at the long wooden table. Sometimes, they talked about mundane things, whether the farm, the news. Other times, they simply sat in comfortable silence. She realized how much she had mistaken noise for intimacy. This quiet was something else, something almost sacred. Few neighbors whispered about them, of course. That was inevitable. A young woman, fresh from a broken engagement, moving in with a widowed man twice her age. It was a perfect recipe for gossip, but she was too tired to care what they said. She had spent too many years shaping herself to please other people. This time, she wouldn't apologize for surviving. One evening, he surprised her by bringing home a puppy, a wiry little terrier with bright eyes and a tail that never stopped wagging. She really laughed, for the first time in months. As she cradled the puppy in her arms, she felt something soften inside her. Maybe it was okay to let small joys in again. She started keeping a journal. Every day, she wrote a single sentence. I am still here. It became her quiet rebellion against all the people who thought she'd disappear without her ex-fiancé. Each line was proof that she was more than what had been done to her. She was someone who kept showing up, and when she looked across the table at Mr. Langford, she didn't feel trapped. She felt possible, like two imperfect people could build something real, not out of desperation, but out of choice. The letter that changed everything. A few months into her new life, she received a letter she hadn't expected. It came in a plain envelope with no return address. She almost threw it away, thinking it was another debt notice or some leftover business from the wedding that never happened. But something made her open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to her ex-fiancé's mother, woman she had once called Mom. The words were formal, but beneath them, she could feel the strain, the shame. They wanted her to know he was engaged again, that the wedding would be in the fall, and that she was not welcome to contact the family. For a moment, she felt her chest tighten. Even after everything, part of her had clung to the hope that someone might have defended her, that someone might have told the truth, but this letter was proof that no one ever would. They were closing the door and bolting it shut. She folded the paper carefully and set it on the kitchen table. Mr. Langford came in and saw her expression. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just poured her a cup of tea and sat across from her, waiting until she was ready to speak. She realized then how much that simple patience meant to her. When she finally told him, he didn't look surprised. "People will do anything to protect the stories they need to believe," he said softly. "Even if it means rewriting you as the villain." She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. It wasn't fair, but it was true. That night, she burned the letter in the fireplace. As the paper curled and turned to ash, she felt something loosen in her ribcage. It wasn't closure, but it was the first step toward releasing the last thread that tied her to a life that never valued her. She slept better than she had in weeks. The quiet days after the letter, she settled into a routine that felt almost like peace. Every morning, she woke early, opened all the curtains, and let the light fill her small apartment. She took long walks through the neighborhood, learning the names of flowers she'd never bothered to notice before. She began keeping a journal not just to record the hurt, but to capture the small joys, the taste of coffee sipped in silence, the softness of fresh sheets she bought for herself, the feeling of a day that belonged to no one else. Each page was a declaration. She was still here, still worthy. Sometimes, she would catch herself looking at her phone, expecting a message that would never come, an apology, an explanation, a confession. But with every silent hour, she started to understand that she didn't need any of those things to move forward. Mr. Langford visited often, bringing flowers from the old garden or tins of shortbread he claimed he didn't like but bought anyway. He never pushed her to talk, never tried to fill the spaces with advice. He just sat nearby, a quiet witness to her rebuilding. One afternoon, he handed her an envelope with her name in his shaky handwriting. Inside was a small note. "You deserve more than survival," it said. "You deserve to bloom." She pressed the paper to her chest, feeling something warm spread through her, even as tears blurred her vision. That evening, she realized she was no longer waiting for the past to come back and save her. She was finally learning to save herself. The unexpected invitation one morning, as she watered the potted violets by her window. A letter arrived with no return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar, delicate, almost hesitant. She turned it over twice in her hands before finally opening it, her breath held tight in her throat. Inside was an invitation. Her sister was hosting a small gathering, just family, it said. An attempt at peace, an acknowledgement that too much had been left unsaid. The words were polite, but she could feel the fear woven between the lines. Maybe her sister knew that forgiveness was not something easily claimed for a long time. She stood in the kitchen, the invitation spread open on the counter. She imagined the faces she would see, the apologies that might come, the justifications she had no interest in hearing. Her heart thudded with old pain, raw and unhealed. Mr. Langford found her there when he came by that afternoon. He studied her face, then the letter. "You don't have to go," he said gently. "Not if it will cost you your peace." But she wasn't sure if peace meant staying away, or finally confronting everything she'd buried that night. She lay awake, the invitation on her nightstand. Part of her ached to tear it up, to close that chapter forever. Another part wanted to look them all in the eye and say, "You don't get to decide who I am now." In the dark, she knew one thing for certain. No matter what she chose, she would be choosing it for herself. The table set for truth when the day came. She dressed simply, a dark blue dress, no jewelry except her wedding band. As she stood at the mirror, she told her reflection, "You owe them nothing, but you owe yourself honesty." Her hands were steady as she slipped her shoes on, her heart surprisingly calm. The house was just as she remembered, though somehow smaller. The porch creaked under her steps. Her sister opened the door, eyes wide and glassy, her mouth shaping a greeting that didn't quite find its voice. They stood there for a moment, two women joined by blood but divided by years of resentment. Inside, the others were already gathered, cousins, a few aunts' faces that looked away when she entered, as if her presence made them complicit. She took a seat at the long oak table without waiting to be offered one. The silence that followed was thick and uneasy. Her sister cleared her throat, trying to speak, but it was their mother, frail and tired, who finally broke it. "I know we've all failed you," she whispered, "and I'm sorry for every moment you felt alone." The words cracked in the air, brittle with regret. She didn't cry, she listened, and when it was her turn, she spoke plainly. She described the loneliness, the nights she spent questioning her own worth, the way the truth had shattered what little trust she had left. No one interrupted her. No one dared. When she finished, she felt lighter, like shedding an old coat she'd been carrying for decades, and she knew, sitting at that table, that she was no longer the woman who needed their approval. The last goodbye after the conversation ended, she stepped outside alone, needing air that wasn't thick with apology. The garden was overgrown, but the late afternoon light caught the roses her father once tended. She ran her hand along the petals, remembering how he used to cut them fresh for the table. Her sister followed quietly, stopping a few feet behind her. There was a tremor in her voice when she finally spoke. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her eyes fixed on the ground, "but I hope, someday, you might understand why I couldn't tell you." She turned to face her, feeling both distant and unbearably close. "I don't need to understand it," she replied. "I just need to know that from here on, there will be no more lies between us." For the first time in years, her sister nodded without excuses. They stood there, not embracing, but not turning away either. It was the smallest possible truce, fragile as a single strand of hair. But it was more than she'd ever thought she would have. Before she left, she walked through the rooms of the house, saying a silent goodbye to each one. It wasn't about nostalgia, it was about reclaiming the pieces of herself she'd left in every corner. The hallway, the kitchen, the old bedroom with the cracked wallpaper, all of it. She closed the front door behind her and didn't look back. For the first time, she felt sure that her story didn't live in those walls anymore. It lived in her, and only she could decide how it would end. The beginning after the end. Weeks passed, and the heaviness began to lift. She started each morning with a simple ritual: making coffee, opening her journal, and writing one sentence about what she'd survived. It was her way of proving to herself she hadn't been defeated. Her daughter asked fewer questions but seemed lighter, too. There were still moments when pain rose up between them like a wall, but they were learning how to climb over it together. Healing, she discovered, didn't look like forgetting, it looked like choosing to keep moving forward anyway. One evening, she sat on the porch as the sun sank behind the trees. She felt a strange gratitude, even for the heartbreak. Without it, she might never have woken up to the truths she'd ignored. Without it, she might never have discovered her own strength. Sometimes, she thought about the letters she'd burned, and the secrets that turned to ash in her hands. The past would always be part of her story, but it no longer held the power to define her. That belonged to her alone now. She began to share her experience, first with a small support group, then in essays she posted online. Messages poured in, women thanking her for her honesty, for saying out loud what so many had felt in silence. Each message reminded her that survival was contagious. On a rainy night, she finally wrote to Brenda, the woman who gave voice to stories like hers. She shared everything, trusting that her truth deserved to be heard. Brenda replied with a simple promise: "Your story will help someone else rise, just like you did." If you felt something reading this, please subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment if you've ever carried a secret too heavy to hold. And don't miss our next story, where a woman uncovers a hidden life her husband left behind, piece by piece, until the day she decided to expose it all.